Political turmoil and uncertainty sweeping across Europe has its roots in the macroeconomy. Rather than improve as everyone keeps promising, European voters realize the situation is not getting any better, and they are expressing their anger in various ways at the ballot box. And this isn't strictly a European phenomenon, as the risk of it spilling over across the rest of the world is rising too. The latest updates from Europe on the economy were just ugly, punctuating the growing unrest among the population. The French election this past weekend is a perfect example, where according to Pew, a whopping 75% of people in France rated the economy as bad before going into the election. The common theme among all of these recent elections is tossing out the incumbents, no matter who they happen to be, like Germany and the UK, perhaps the US too. Disinflation isn't what was promised. Authorities made it seem like prices would go back down after they soared. They never do after supply shock, so everyone was basically lied to, a lie of omission. Instead, prices have gone up, and the rate of change has come back. Huge difference. People were willing to tolerate a slower economy because they were told that's how disinflation, as they understood it, would take place. They tolerated the recession, or stagnation as governments and ECB officials call it, believing the recession was a sacrifice everyone needed to make for prices to normalize. Now that they realize that lower prices aren't going to happen, the prospect of losing their jobs only makes it that much more unbearable. In fact, according to Pew's survey results just last month, economic ratings in 34 countries all around the world, not just Europe, that the Pew Research Center surveyed this year are, on balance, more bad than good, and that's putting it kindly. A median of about 2/3 of adults, 64%, rate their country's economic situation poorly. The surveys were fielded amid stalled global trade and slow economic growth around the world. They call it slow economic growth, but in a lot of places it's already recession with rising unemployment. But since no government is willing to stand up and say, yeah, we've got a recession, because no one is willing to say that, the most anybody ever says is, well, a strong and resilient economy that might be slowing down. People know the difference, and they are voting on those differences. According to Pew's results, 78% of those in the UK that they surveyed said that the economy was bad. And what did the UK election just show us? They threw out the conservative government after 14 years. France, as I mentioned, 75% rated the economy as bad. Germany, only 61% rated it bad, but that was up from 52% last year, and Germany might be the worst case out of everybody. It must be the Germans don't like to say so, at least the pollsters, but they do when they vote, according to the last European parliamentary elections. Italy, 76% rate the economy as bad as well. But it's not just Europe. All around the world, we see the same thing. South Korea, 82% there said their economy was bad. Japan, where the Bank of Japan is raising rates because they think the economy is booming and it's about to be inflationary. Instead, 76% of the people in Japan say the economy is bad. And it's all the same story everywhere because this is globally synchronized. Prices surged during the supply shock, and they are not going to go back down, and people realize they're not going to go back down. At the same time, they realize the economy isn't just slowing, it is recessionary. And this is the kind of stuff that we go over at Eurodollar University in our memberships and our subscriptions to cut through the mainstream spin and misdirection. That's why we offer our memberships and subscriptions, and they are now on sale at some of the lowest prices we've offered since our launch. We've got tons of videos on everything from the basics of money and financial concepts, even the basics of QE and QT, the history of money, and especially ledger money. A deep dive into all of these topics where we go far deeper behind everything I bring up here on YouTube, as well as a daily briefing that keeps you up to date on everything that's happening in money and macro. The anniversary sale prices are for a limited time, so check them all out at our website, eurodollar.university. So with everyone already unhappy about the situation in Europe, we get increasing data from various government sources which show exactly why they're unhappy. Because the economy last year, they said, was just stagnation, which was really recession, but it was supposed to rebound in 2024. As bad as it was last year, as bad as it's been really since the fall of 2022, consumer price changes are coming down, disinflation. At the same time, the economy is supposed to be picking up. Instead, what we see is that consumer prices are continuing to increase, even if at a slower rate. At the same time, the economy is falling deeper into recession. There was a rebound in the spring, but there was a rebound last spring too. And more the data shows not just that the European economy is rolling over before it has a chance to recover, it is getting downright ugly on this latest rollover. The latest from Europe in terms of retail sales shows basically the same thing. Retail sales were up 0.1% month over month. That was after falling in the month of April. These statistics are for May. In nominal terms, they were up a little bit. Again, there was a pickup in March in European retail sales, especially nominal retail sales, that suggested Europe was back on the road to recovery. But it was only the 1 month in retail sales, and already the growth rates and even some contraction since then suggest that it was just a one-time seasonal swing that we see every season. Now that the pickup is stalled, the downstream consequences continue to flow in. Talked about the PMIs recently. Europe's PMIs from S&P Global or Hamburg Commercial Bank. The composite was 50.9. That's down from 52.2. These are for the month of June. The services composite had peaked back in April, down to 52.8, so lost half a point over the last couple of months. And again, that's perfectly consistent with what we saw last year and to an extent in 2022. There's a seasonal upswing which everybody gets all excited about, only to see it fall off and roll over heading into the summertime, pushing Europe deeper into recession. The difference this year is that unemployment rates are rising in a number of different places across Europe, as well as the rest of the world. So this year, if the European economy does indeed roll over, as all of the statistics are showing us, that's likely to mean this year what will be different is more unemployment on top of prices that are not going back. And you can understand, therefore, why voters are increasingly angry and expressing that anger at the ballot box. Germany is one of the key countries that we follow in Europe, not just because it's a big economy, the biggest economy in Europe, and therefore it means a lot for the European system, but more importantly, it is a trade hub, a massive trade hub that tells us a lot about the conditions around the rest of the world. So as Germany goes, it's not quite as Germany goes, the rest of the world goes. It's more like the rest of the world goes, so does Germany, though Germany has added its own drags and spin on the downturn as well. And the statistics reflect exactly what I've been telling you all along. The Germany is not recovering in 2024. There might have been a modest increase in sentiment more than anything, though a little bit of an uptick in retail sales and consumer spending. But as far as the trade economy and goods economy, it's not happening at all. We start with German factory orders. German factory orders have been down for all 5 months up to May of 2024 thus far. And in the month of May, German factory orders were down a sharp 1.3% month over month. And that brought the index down to its lowest level since February 2021. Not the rate of change, the index itself. The amount of factory orders the German government believes the German factory sector is getting is the least since February of 2021, going back 3 years. And it's mostly because of weakness outside of Germany, and really outside the Eurozone too. As Europe is in recession, factory orders have been largely stagnant, at least according to Germany's data. But outside of the Eurozone, factory orders into Germany fell 4.6% month over month in May. They're the lowest since September of 2020. The least amount of factory orders, the least amount of demand from outside of Europe for German factories since September 2020. The situation outside of Europe as well as inside of Germany is getting worse, not better. We saw that in terms of actual production. Now, factory orders are forward-looking, so that's already concerning. But in terms of actual production or industrial production from Germany, the latest data that just came out, not good at all. Minus 2.5% month over month. Now, there have been a couple good months in German industrial production, unlike some of the other statistics like factory orders. But German industrial production to start this year looked like Germany was finally starting to turn a corner, and that there was a recovery happening in the economy. So they had 2 good months of industrial production in January and February. And as of the latest month, it just plunged to a new low, even lower than December. It is the lowest volume of output since July of 2010, outside of April and May of 2020. Again, not rate of change. Actual output from Germany's factories and utilities and construction, I believe, as well as what mining sector there is left in the country. Essentially, the lowest level of total industrial output since July of 2010, when the country was just trying to struggle its way out of the Great Not Recession. So that goes to show that the German economy isn't turning a corner, it is actually rolling over, and the situation is getting worse very quickly. The latest stats from the German government on exports down 3.6% in the month of May alone. And they had been up, again, the springtime rebound. They've been up in March and April, then boom, right back down to the lows in December. 3.6% drop in exports. Again, demand for German goods from around the rest of the world falling off after a modest increase to start out 2024, rolling over and doing so sharply. Imports into Germany, really ugly, down 6.6% and almost exactly matching the December lows. So German trade suggests that, okay, there might have been a moderate upturn, a fluctuation at the start of the year, rising sentiment, the idea of disinflation being a positive factor, but again, we're seeing the pattern where it goes down, it rolls over. And this year, unlike in previous years with unemployment rising, the rolling over is even more substantial and even more concerning than it had been in 2023. And so the implications are not just Europe and European elections, as substantial as those are. They apply to a whole lot of global economic factors and global economic situations. As the World Trade Organization wrote in its last report, international trade, a key engine of global prosperity since the fall of the Berlin Wall, has ground nearly to a halt and is set to remain anemic in the coming years. In 2023, trade in goods and services expanded by the slenderest of margins, an estimated just 0.2%, the slowest pace in 50 years outside of global recessions. Well, maybe they need to rethink that whole, was there a global recession last year? And it would have declined outright, but for the growth of trade in services. Trade in goods shrank roughly 2%, the sharpest contraction during the century outside of global recession. Again, they might need to rethink global recession. Trade growth, here's the important part. Trade growth will improve this year, 2024, but it will still be half the average rate in the decade before the pandemic. In fact, by the end of 2024, global trade will register the slowest half decade of growth since the 1990s, and that's assuming that 2024 actually improves. What we're seeing from Europe, as well as a lot of countries in Asia, starting with China, it's not improving. And then you add the US and the rising unemployment problem there, and trade in 2024 may not actually improve at all. This second half rebound that everyone's betting on, Europe climbing out of its recession to start with, the data continues to show that there was a modest uptick, as I keep saying, and then rolling over. Weakness, unemployment, angry voters. A world economy that may have been in recession last year and is likely to be experiencing recession this year. That's what the falling off of trade is actually telling us. That the situation is not strong and resilient, as everyone keeps saying, and now we're piling unemployment on top of price changes that impoverished enough people around the world. It's a bad situation. Even the UN Trade and Development Organization, which forecasts global growth at just 2.6% in its latest forecast. And by the way, they define a global recession as when global GDP rises just 2.5%. So they're already saying in 2024, the world economy, the entire world economy is right on the cusp of recession after the WTO said trade looks like the world's in recession. So the numbers are right there already. And everyone is forecasting a better year in 2024 than in 2023. Here's what the UN said. Their latest report highlights the global economy's growing reliance on private consumption, projected to increase by about 4%, outpacing total income growth. Historically, such increases in consumption have often relied on borrowing. And with savings accumulated during the pandemic largely depleted to pre-2020 levels, that is likely becoming a primary source of consumption. So what they're saying is we've stayed out of recession, at least according to their view and their numbers, largely because of the savings that had been accumulated from the pandemic. Now those are gone, and the economic indications are all increasingly negative. With no savings to support it, the only thing left that could possibly support consumption, which is the primary driver of the global economy, keeping it just barely out of recession thus far, that will be debt. at a time when banks around the world, especially in Europe as well as the United States, are increasingly shutting down their loan books. So you put all of these factors together, an economy that, according to these mainstream sources, were already right there on the cusp of recession to begin with. Now we've got unemployment, we've got economies in Europe rolling over, got questions about the US, China, and everything else. 2024 isn't going to turn out to be the year where everything stabilizes and starts heading towards recovery. It's the year where all of the negative factors finally synchronize up and lead us into the globally synchronized recession. And that's increasingly negative thought, especially among the world's voters, because they had been told that disinflation meant prices were going to normalize as they understood that. No one stopped and said prices are going to go way up and then the rate of change will slow down and they're going to continue to rise from that high perch that they had gone to during the supply shock. So a lot of voters were willing to accept slower growth and stagnation, however you want to put it, a nice spin on it. They were willing to accept that as long as that meant that prices were going to materially change. Now that they realize that they've been impoverished and that they traded a lot of economic potential for that impoverishment, they are increasingly angry and bitter about this, as they should be, because they were sold, pun intended, a bill of goods that had no realistic chance of happening. Governments and central banks should have leveled with the public and said, look, this is what happens in a supply shock. Prices go way up and then they normalize at that higher level. And what we're hoping is that incomes will eventually follow along, therefore giving people the purchasing power to afford those higher prices. And it'll be a rough transition, sorry about that, but that's what has to happen. But increasingly voters are realizing that this is what happens in prices, but also understanding that the pathway to normalize incomes to those higher prices isn't happening either. So they're being impoverished, and they realize they're being impoverished with no clear way out of it. And they're expressing that anger at the ballot box. So what we're seeing in Europe in terms of the macroeconomy as well as the political situation is not strictly a European risk. The dangers of it spilling over to the rest of the world aren't just high, we're already seeing the signs everywhere, including the United States. Unemployment is not just a European worry. It's happening right here in the US, as the June jobs numbers showed. Another increase in the unemployment rate, and I talked about that in the latest video. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Check out Eurodollar University's anniversary sale. If you are a member and subscriber, I cannot thank you enough. And until next time, take care.